as we know too that another thing that was happening a lot in the 60s was assassination. Assassination of people who began to become leaders, and we're speaking of more revolutionary, radical, Uranian themes. You can look at JFK, you can look at Robert Kennedy, you can look at MLK, and they all had this Uranian, about freedom and equality, and we could argue about it, but we won't. The Saturn forces didn't like this. So you can see that those Uranian forces are very dangerous. Those revolutionary forces are very dangerous to the structures that exist. So there has been talk, and we can get into this more, but that this election feels like there's more volatility, that there could be more dangers. We did have, I don't know if anyone's aware, but that first night, there was an arrest of people who had a whole plan to assassinate Obama. And I don't think this is going away, whatever happens in the next few months, because of this similar planetary opposition in the sky. Now, there will be 5 exact oppositions of Saturn Uranus between 2008 and 2010. So there's a lot of this really powerful, tense tug-of-war energy happening in the sky. Okay, so that's a little overview of the day of the elections, okay? So what we want to do is, when we're looking at who might come to power, there's a few different things we would look at, okay? Obviously, we want to look at, like we've been doing a little bit, okay, what's the U.S. chart? What's happening in the U.S.? We want to look at the election day chart itself. And the chart for that is at 12 a.m. when the first ballots are dropped in New Hampshire, okay? So we want to look at that chart. We also want to look at the inauguration chart, which ultimately seems to be even more powerful than the election day chart. Why? Because what happens on inauguration is what takes place over the next 4 years, not the election. So we can have something that happens on the election not necessarily be represented in what happens on the inauguration. This was very much maybe prevalent in the last 2 elections. So we have those charts to look at. We obviously want to also look, like I said, at the next 4 years. And what we're doing each time is we're looking at what's called Synastry. And Synastry means to join the stars. And we can look at the Synastry that each candidate has with every one of those charts. So what is the Synastry that Obama, McCain, Palin, and Biden, what do they have with the U.S. chart? What do they have with the election chart? What do they have with the inauguration chart? And what do they have in the next few years? And there's a couple charts we look at. We look at their natal charts, but we also look at something called the progress chart. The progress chart represents the unfolding or the evolving nature of a person's soul, or even a country's soul, okay? So we have to look at both of those because they're very important and they're really powerful predictive tools. The other thing that I'm going to mention is just the natural cycles, these progressions, and what in Vedic astrology, Indian astrology, I'm going to mention is called the dashas, or the planetary periods that each candidate is in. This is a kind of a large period of time that a candidate or any person goes through. And then these are broken up into smaller periods of time called bhuktis. They're basically just planetary periods. And what these are basically a kind of phase of life we go through. And when we look back at the birth chart and how the dasha and bhukti relate to the birth chart, that can give us a very powerful predictive tool for what's coming in a person's life. In Vedic astrology, which is not my area of expertise, so I'm really pulling from some really powerful Vedic astrologers on this. But in the Vedic system, this dasha bhukti technique is the #1 predictive tool. So when I mention it, I want to emphasize that because Vedic astrology really prides itself on prediction. And so working with progressions, working with what's called transits, where the planets are in the sky and how they affect a person's natal chart and their progress chart. And working with these Vedic dasha bhuktis, that's this big picture for each candidate of what's possible, what's the potential here. So I figured, with all this information, the best way to organize this was to kind of just look at, okay, what does election day look like, generally? And then let's start looking at each candidate's relationship to these charts, okay? And okay, so that's what we're going to do. The other thing is, mention one more thing because it's an area I focus on, which is the relocation chart. I haven't heard many other astrologers talk about this, but it seems to me that if we look at Washington, D.C. as a possibility of relocation for every one of these candidates, it should signify that the charts that we look at, the maps, what's called astrocartography, or latitude params, or local space lines. These are all terms for different planets' crossings at a specific place on the globe. All of those could show us, and should show us, where one of these candidates, or multiple candidates, if they have a strong resonance with Washington, D.C. And if they, we'll call it a place of power, a place of building a home. And so I looked at that as well. So I'm going to briefly mention that. So there's a number of factors, and obviously I can't go totally deep into every one, but I want to get this dialogue going so we can talk about all of these things. Okay, so on election day, I mentioned the Saturn Uranus opposition. And what is really important that's happening that day, that is an overarching theme for basically a lot of the next year, in particular candidates' chart, is that when the polls start on election day, the moon is in Capricorn. And the moon, Capricorn is very similar to the Saturn energy. Capricorn was ruled by Saturn. And so it has that quality of the structures, the systems that are intact, the ruling, the party that has been, the conservative. But by the end of the day, the moon moves into Aquarius, which you're going to hear these words a lot. You're going to hear Aquarius talked about a lot. Again, the new, the innovative, the revolutionary, the radical, the eccentric. Obama has a lot of Aquarius in his chart. And what's happening, though, this is the big point, is that there's something called a void of course moon. And the void of course moon, the traditional, this is throughout the last couple of thousand years, the description of this is whatever is begun under a void of course moon will amount to nothing. Nothing will come of it. Why? Because the moon in a void of course moon is changing signs. It's made its last aspect to any other planet, and it's about to shift into a new sign. When we choose a chart for someone, an electional chart, like you're going to go to surgery, you're going to get married, you're going to start a business, we would never start it under a void of course moon, because nothing will come of it. It's like the moon is in a bardo. It's in a non-place. And the moon is this very powerful emotional force within us. So we never do that.